Europe, as the world's largest economy, is facing a challenge. On the one hand, it aspires to retain its global trading position and at the same time be the leading regulator on sustainability. Is it possible to combine the two? And what is Europe doing to achieve this? I am Ivana Damjanovic, and with my colleague Nicolas de Sadeleer, we will delve into the links between trade and sustainable development and provide different perspectives on the European Union's trade and sustainability agenda. Sustainable development has become a buzzword. Since its inception in 1987 Brundtland report, it has been subject to different interpretations, and it has found its way into different international instruments, for example in 1992 Rio Declaration.
Indeed.
So how would you define this concept?
Well, in most of these instruments, the concept is not defined. The concept recounts upon three pillars. Economic growth that must integrate a high level of labor protection as well as high level of environmental protection. It's an exercise of reconciliations between growth on the one hand and the protection to be afforded to the workers and to the environment.
So the three pillars: economy, society, environment.
Yes, correct.
Would you say then that sustainable development is a legal principle in international law?
So far, international courts have been hesitant in framing it as a legal principle.
But usually when you meet this term sustainability or sustainable, it's in context where there is no legal frameworks. So the basic example is when you buy a product, a cleaning product, for example, in a plastic bottle, where you have the term sustainable written on it. It's hard to know what it means because there is no proper legal framework or legal definition of what it means.
There is kind of consensus about sustainable development, but it's also a fake consensus because when you go beyond of the term, you see that everyone has a different definition and weigh differently the different part or the three parts of the sustainable development.
So if it's not a legal principle, what is then the obligation of states in relation to implementation of sustainable development?
First and foremost, there is no internal obligation placed upon states to enhance sustainability. In addition, there is no general framework treaty obliging states to conduct sustainable growth, for instance. That being said, one has to take into consideration the different principles likely to flesh out sustainability in various policies.
So what would you say are some of those principles in substantive terms?
The most obvious principle will be pollute pays, precaution, prevention of hazards. In addition, I will quote the obligation to integrate environmental concerns into other policies or the right to development.
And of course there are also procedural principles like the right to access information.
In addition, there is the obligation to conduct environmental impact assessment studies whenever the consequence of a development project is likely to harm the environment of a third state.
So indeed an area of principles that we actually associate with sustainable development.
Yes. So to sum up, sustainability is a concept deprived of legal effect. Nonetheless, it's being implemented by a flurry of principles and rights.
We could then say that legal status of sustainable development in international law is inconclusive, but what about EU law?
Under the EU treaty, sustainability is enshrined as a key objective interlinked with the establishment and the functioning of the internal market. In addition, sustainability recounts upon the three pillars we just discussed: economic growth, high level of environmental protection, and labor protection.
So obviously there is a legal obligation to implement sustainability in internal action. What about the EU's external action? What about trade, investment, foreign policy?
Under the EU treaty, the institutions are obligated to integrate the objectives and the key principles enshrined in the treaties. So I agree, the common commercial policy must flesh out sustainability into different legal instruments.
So in which ways has the EU been linking trade and sustainable development? What are the EU's regulatory approaches to addressing its global footprint?
One can identify three approaches: multilateral, bilateral, as well as unilateral.
So multilateral, looking at the EU action in multilateral forums, international bodies.
Given that the EU and the 27 member states are parties to the World Trade Organization, they exert a significant influence on the decision-making process of that organization.
Precisely because the current context is much more tense, we need, as a European Union, to take a little bit of a leadership role in cooperation with others, like Australia, which is, of course, very committed to the WTO as well, to make sure that the WTO can perform the functions of acting as a guardrail of stability in what is going to be a much more turbulent trading environment.
We've seen that multilateral efforts have been in crisis, especially in the context of WTO, and more with that shift from trade liberalization, from removal of tariffs towards what we call deep trade agenda and regulatory cooperation. The preferred approach has been bilateral, so cooperation within the framework of preferential trade agreements. How are sustainability issues incorporated in these agreements?
The trade treaties concluded by the EU with the third states include specific chapters dedicated to sustainability. So these chapters include a number of provisions ranging from the non-regression obligations to the proper enforcement of international conventions.
But of course these chapters are not the whole picture. We have to look at these issues in the context of FTA as a whole.
Look at public procurement. In order to address green public procurement, one has to look at the chapter dedicated to public procurement. Look at the restrictions placed upon trading or placing on market GM products. They have to be addressed under the TBT chapter or the SPS chapters of these free trade agreements.
And the issues like precautionary principle are also included in other chapters.
Yes, in particular, take the case of CETA. There is a specific provisions dedicated to the precautionary approach in order to address uncertain risks.
So we need to change the way we see, for example, trade agreements. I think we should stop asking ourselves, okay, is this trade agreement having any negative impact on the environment? The question should be more like how a trade agreement can actually support and help achieving environmental objectives.
So you re-articulate the question of growth, the question of environmental question and social in a different setting, no longer about thinking how we can compete and who will win, but how we can cooperate that we have the same goal.
What would you say are core principles that we find in trade and sustainable development chapters? You mentioned non-regression clause. What do you mean by that?
Under domestic law, be it the French or the Belgian domestic law, the lawmakers cannot lower down the standards of protections. And this principle has been introduced in a number of international commercial treaties, be investment treaties, be trade treaties, in order to avoid a race to the bottom.
And what about the race to the top? Could we say that these chapters aim towards the race to the top?
Indeed, there are a number of provisions, however extremely vague, encouraging states to reach a high level of protection with respect to sustainability.
So you would say these clauses are more aspirational?
Yes, indeed, I fully agree with your comment.
And what about the pre-existing international obligations that we find in these chapters?
Under these chapters, the parties are obligated to implement genuinely different conventions ranging from a human rights convention to environmental agreements such as CITES agreement or the Convention on Biodiversity.
And that's what, if you want me to characterize the fundamental objective that we are pursuing, it is not a level playing field objective. That's not the fundamental objective that we pursue through the trade and sustainable development chapters. It is much more to ensure that both sides to a privileged trade relationship have a common commitment to the effective implementation of these core values, which are multilateral values. It's not the European Union trying to promote its own values, but they are multilateral values reflected on multilateral conventions.
And would you say that these obligations are effectively implemented through trade agreements?
The main challenge is, at least with respect to environmental agreements, they are rather vague. Accordingly, it's rather difficult to enforce them correctly.
Could you provide some examples?
For instance, the Convention on Biodiversity provides a very general obligation regarding the conservation of habitats, ecosystems, species, but without any quantitative criteria.
Given that these obligations are rather vague in TSD chapters, what is the added value of having them?
It seems to me that the parties to the treaties can really address the genuine enforcement of these conventions, not only a de jure enforcement, a de facto proper enforcement of these international obligations.
But of course, what we always emphasize is the need for an effective implementation of those agreements, and the need to use also the bilateral dialogue to reinforce the commitment from both sides to the implementation of those multilateral agreements.
I think we have a good example with the latest agreements that were negotiated with Australia and New Zealand, where we see there that there is an increased ambition in the commitments the commitments in those chapters, moving away a little bit from the vague commitments that we can find in existing trade agreements.
And of course, with the new EU's approach in 2022, there is also a possibility to have trade sanctions.
Yes, the sanctions can be a triggering factor favoring a proper enforcement of these international obligations.
Of course, the sanctions are only limited to core breaches of labor obligations as well as the breaches of the Paris Agreement.
And that would be very difficult to demonstrate.
In other words, what is action or inaction that materially defeats the purpose of the Paris Agreement is very difficult to demonstrate.
Yes, I fully agree. The EU lawmaker is adopting a range of directives and regulations that do regulate trade in products and commodities. Therefore, the EU is addressing sustainability through these different unilateral measures.
So basically, we're talking here about EU legislation that has impact on third countries, or what we would say extraterritorial effect.
In effect, these measures taking into consideration the sustainability of the process through which these products are processed abroad.
When you look at what is going to be seen in the proposal for the CS3D, the due diligence directive we call it, then we think that about 55,000 large companies will be directly responsible for having this due diligence on their whole value chain. But if you tell with that all the people in their value chain, in Europe there will be many more than 55,000 companies impacted by that. We just need to ask ourselves, how do you, as a large company, make your due diligence possible on 200,000 suppliers, for instance? How do you do that?
It's of great added value. We really see this legislation, I mean due diligence legislation in general, as a very important game changer.
mentioned the European Green Deal, the idea that Europe has to transform itself, and in order to do that, there are a number of measures that have been undertaken. What are some of these measures that concern more Europe internally, like issues regarding waste?
Actually, the EU is working on a major reform of waste law in order to prompt the circular economy. Under the circular economy, waste is not supposed to be valueless anymore. Waste is becoming a resource in its own right, supposed to integrate the economy.
Business has to take into consideration the new reality, and the new reality is a reality of more scarcity than in the past.
And in what aspects that concerns external dimension?
Well, we are in front of a mountain of household waste that's mostly discarded or disposed of in Europe. On the other hand, we have electronic waste as mostly being exported, and Europe is losing a number of critical raw materials. In case this electronic waste is recycled in Europe, Europe will be less dependent from foreign markets.
So again, endorsing that vision of strategic autonomy.
Yes, indeed, and we see clearly that internal domestic measures do have an impact upon international trade.
But it is clear that in a turbulent world we need to be able to have a capacity to react, to defend our autonomous choices, but at the same time we want to do it as much as possible in partnership with our partners and without retracting to our commitment to the rule-based trading order.
It doesn't make sense that we have a Fit 55 in Europe if there is no solution for Africa.
We discussed the European Union's approach to trade and sustainability in great length. We talked to different experts, we heard views of stakeholders. So what are some of the conclusions that we can draw about the EU's trade and sustainability agenda? Nicolas, I think one of the conclusions is certainly that we can see links between the EU's internal and external agenda.
The Green Deal objectives are known to be extremely ambitious. A Green Deal so far is mostly about domestic measures to enhance circular economy, to foster the shift to renewables and so on and so forth. However, that won't be sufficient to address the global footprint of Europe. For that reason, there is a need to build up a number of complementary measures in order to address that global footprint.
So basically the internal transformation of Europe goes hand in hand with its global footprint.
I fully agree with your comment. We need, in addition to the domestic measures, additional measures, be it bilateral measures or unilateral measures, to entice third states to embark upon a new visions of sustainability.
That leads us to the second conclusion, which is the complementarity of different measures at unilateral, bilateral and multilateral levels.
For instance, the deforestation regulation that places due diligence obligations upon importers of different commodities and products is deemed to be an unilateral measures. But deforestation can also be addressed in the frame of the trade agreement, sustainable chapters that create a space for interstate cooperation. In addition, the EU could prompt global negotiation regarding the adoption of a treaty on the protection of the forest.
That leads to a third conclusion, that trade is not only about competitiveness anymore, but it is increasingly about cooperation.
To say the least, cooperation is a key principle of international environmental law. For instance, the TSD chapter is not just about carving out a common playing field for the traders, it's also to sanction the breach of major international conventions regarding human rights or environmental protection.
And finally, when we look at the European Union context more specifically, trade is also about dialogue between different stakeholders.
As we discussed time and again, sustainable development is about reconciling antagonistic interests. Therefore, sustainability requires a dialogue between labor organization, environmental organization and businesses. and a number of FTAs provide for a consensual approach among these different interest groups. However, we discuss also how difficult it is to reach consensus.
So sustainability is not just an adjunct to trade policy, it is something that is very much at the center of what we want to do when we negotiate bilateral agreements, when we promote certain activities in the context of the WTO. And of course, it is also reflected on some of our autonomous instruments which are responding to our ambitions to achieve a sustainable European economy and to be able to achieve net zero.
There is no doubt that Europe sees itself as the champion of sustainability in trade. Whether it will convince others remains to be seen.